Hello friends, and welcome to a special discussion episode of Pokemon Red: The Worst Final Evolutions. With the playthrough now finished, and the team now having been crowned champion, I thought it would be fun to show the process of how I decided on the team, as well as some final thoughts about how everything played out. I realized while I was playing the game that I never really went into too much detail about my choices. If anything, I only touched on them briefly. So in order to shed some light on my team building methods, I'm going to be going through the entire process from start to finish, and give you my thoughts on how I structured this entire playthrough and worst team. This video will be structured into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about how the rules for the challenge were decided, as well as their impact on team building as a whole. I'm sure there were some people that might have seen the no items in battle or set style rules as a given for a challenge like this, but questioned my rule of required HMs on the team. I may have touched on that at the start of the playthrough, but I will give a more detailed explanation as to why I picked those rules here. Next, I'll talk about the process of picking the 6 Pokemon that would be on the team. With a large pool of fully evolved Pokemon to pick from, narrowing it down to the 6 worst wasn't easy. I'll be discussing the reason for my particular picks here, as well as the criteria that went into narrowing down those picks. And who knows, I might have even changed my thoughts as a whole now that I've done the playthrough. I seem to remember a certain mushroom performing astoundingly well in the last few fights of the game, so maybe there might be an open spot on the team now? And finally, I'll be discussing my thoughts on the playthrough as a whole, while giving insight as to how I thought the challenge went. Okay, with that preamble out of the way, let's begin the team building discussion of Pokemon Red: The Worst Final Evolutions. When deciding to do a challenge such as this, the framework is the most important part. So I started this challenge by deciding the rules to which I would follow while playing. Since this was a challenge to use the worst fully evolved Pokemon, I had to pick rules to facilitate that statement. In the end, I settled on 3 rules. I had to play on the set battle style, I couldn't use items in battle, and I had to have all the required HMs, which in this case would be Cut, Strength, and Serve, present on my team in some manner. The first 2 rules go hand in hand with each other, so I will discuss them together. In order for this challenge to be the worst of the worst, I had to create a setup that would objectively show how certain Pokemon wouldn't be able to perform as well as others. If a Pokemon has a favorable type combination and/or a powerful or diverse move pool, they would be able to get through the game by themselves no problem. Conversely, if a Pokemon has an unfavorable type for this game, or has a bad overall move pool to pick from, it would be harder to make progress through the game. The reason that the set style was chosen was because it would more accurately show how those Pokemon would struggle trying to win battles by themselves. And the same holds true for items in battle. I have no objections to people using potions or revives in their Pokemon playthroughs, as that can be its own tactic for winning, but for a challenge to be as objective as possible, I had to remove as many variables as I could so that the worst of the worst would be easier to decide on. If I was able to use potions or revives to my heart's content in battle, then even the worst of the group would be able to win all of its battles just by itself. And all that proves is that any Pokemon can be good as long as there is a healthy stock of potions and revives to keep it thriving. So, no items in battle, and the battle style stays on set. Easy enough to describe. But what about the other rule, that all required HMs must be present on the team? Well, I will admit this one is pretty subjective, but I wanted to emulate the perspective of what I consider the most common type of player who plays Pokemon. To elaborate, when a person plays Pokemon, how that player decides what goes on and stays on the team can have a multitude of factors. That player might only pick a handful of Pokemon to train up and go through the game with. Sometimes they might only pick one Pokemon and just solo the entire game with it. They might even swap Pokemon when a stronger one is acquired, or when the situation calls for it. But what I believe a majority of players who are playing casually will probably do, and especially so for those who are playing the game for the first time, is have a full team of 6 dedicated Pokemon throughout the entire run. And when that happens, they are likely to use all of the necessary HMs within those 6 so that they are able to progress through the game. So this rule is basically saying, if I was to emulate that type of player, what are the 6 worst Pokemon I could pick from that could still get me anywhere into the game without having to have a dedicated HM using Pokemon on my team? Now admittedly, this rule could very well mean that a certain Pokemon, who is not in the 6 worst fully evolved Pokemon by the objective factors of types, stats, or move pool, would suddenly be in the bottom by simple virtue of it being the worst Pokemon that could learn a required HM. I have thought about doing a rule alteration where the 5 worst would end up on the team, and then there would be a 6th member who could use the necessary HMs that can't be learned by the other 5 to aid in travel, but I feel like that would take away from the spirit of the type of player I am trying to play as. Maybe down the line I could tackle this challenge again and try it with this rule variant in mind. But that's a topic for another time. For now, I will be sticking to the decided rules and be as objective as possible within the subjective rule. And that about covers my thoughts on the rules for the setup of this challenge. Speaking of setup, now it's time to talk about the team building process. When trying to build a team for any game, it is important to understand not just the characteristics of the potential members of the team, but the mechanics of the game and how they might impact team building processes as a whole. Pokemon Red and Blue are the first games in the series, meaning that there is only so much that can be worked with in terms of team options, moves, and stats. But what they are most notorious for is how some of the mechanics worked in these games as opposed to later games. For example, the special stat worked as both an offensive stat and a defensive stat, meaning that a high special is statistically better on average when compared to the separate attack and defense stats. In addition, the 15 types in these games were split into physical and special types, meaning the moves that were designated as special would be statistically better on average than a majority of physical moves, due to the way the stats worked. And the strengths and weaknesses of these 15 types were also very imbalanced. I stated numerous times in the playthrough that the Psychic type is a very dangerous type to go up against, due to the high power of most Psychic moves, combined with the majority of those Pokemon having above average special. But the two most difficult parts about taking on Psychic Pokemon are that there is no type, outside of other Psychics, that could resist Psychic moves, and that there is virtually no way to deal super effective damage on Psychic Pokemon. High power bug moves are non-existent, and the Ghost type, which was supposed to be super effective on Psychics, is bugged to be ineffective at dealing any damage to Psychics at all. Not that anyone would try, mind you. Out of all 3 Ghost moves in the game, Lick is the only one that deals any variable damage, and that one is a very weak move. They did fix this imbalance in later games, but in these games, if you were going up against a Psychic Pokemon, you had to be ready for some damage. But one of the most imbalanced mechanics in this game is by far the sleep status. Sleep status, unlike later games, is incredibly potent. In later games, it lasts for only a few turns, usually anywhere from 3 to 5, and the Pokemon who was asleep could use its move that it selected for the turn upon waking up. But in these games, sleep could last for up to 7 turns, and the Pokemon who was asleep still couldn't use a move until the next turn. With proper prediction, a Pokemon could be kept asleep, rendering it useless, just like getting frozen. Getting a key Pokemon asleep could make the difference between winning and losing a fight. This means that these statuses would be too powerful if used properly, and any Pokemon who could apply these statuses would have a huge advantage over others. And for anyone who's now thinking, wait a second, you had a Parasect on your team with a 100% accurate sleep move, how is that a worst of the worst Pokemon? To that I say, yeah, I hear ya. Looking back on it now, I felt like the positive of the move Spore was outweighed by the negatives of Parasect, but as I learned by playing, Parasect has a lot going for it. I'll revisit the point later in the video, but for now, just know that I'm aware of this fact. Anyways, the point is that there is a lot of things that are necessary to factor in when deciding a team. Okay, now that I've gone over how I approach this, let me show you the process I use to decide the team. To start the process of team building, I first made a list of every fully evolved Pokemon in the game. From the large pool of all 151 Pokemon, the list gets shrunk down to 81 once we eliminate all Pokemon that are not fully evolved. From there, I was able to make some more cuts to the list based on other factors. This includes starter Pokemon, traded Pokemon, and legendary Pokemon. The starter Pokemon in any Pokemon game are designed to be stronger than average to help a trainer progress through the games easier, and Venusaur, Charizard, and Blastoise are no exception. They are all statistically strong and are able to hold their own throughout the game, so they are exempted from the list. Next, Pokemon that evolve by trade. While I would have been unable to acquire these Pokemon anyways, due to being unable to trade Pokemon to another player, the fact that Machamp, Golem, Gengar, and especially Alakazam are all good Pokemon means I don't have to feel bad for exempting them from the list. Finally, legendary Pokemon. This one's just a given really. Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres, Mewtwo, and Mew are all quite powerful, and sometimes acquired too late or even unobtainable at all, meaning that it would be impractical to even consider them for the team. With all of that said, cutting these 12 Pokemon off the list leaves us with 69 potential options for the team, so we're looking much better now that there is less than half of the original list remaining. As a quick aside, I want to talk about version-exclusive Pokemon. These are Arbok, Vileplume, Primeape, Arcanine, Scyther, and Electabuzz for Pokemon Red, and Sandslash, Ninetales, Persian, Victreebel, Magmar, and Pinsir for Pokemon Blue. None of them ended up on my team, meaning the run could have been done on either version. But if one of them did, it would mean that the team could only be made in one game, and a separate team would have to be made for the other. This is a factor I made sure to keep in mind while making the team. Okay, aside over. Next, I took a look at what Pokemon could learn what HM moves, since that was a rule for this challenge. I'll talk about Cut and Strength in a moment because I want to focus on Surf first. From the remaining list of Pokemon, only 22 of them can learn Surf. The biggest problem is that most of the Pokemon are Water-type, and if you remember what I said before in regards to types, that makes most Water-type Pokemon exempt from this list, since all Water-type Pokemon that can learn Surf had access to a high-power Water move. Even Kingler, whose low special stat made me consider it for the team, could still use Water moves to some degree of effectiveness, and has a massive attack stat to help back it up. So this meant I needed a non-Water-type Pokemon to use the move, and that left me with only 7 options: Nidoking, Nidoqueen, Lickitung, Rhydon, Kangaskhan, Snorlax, and Dragonite. Dragonite is acquired way too late to even be considered, and its stats are comparable to legendary Pokemon, so no problem leaving it off the list. Nidoking and Nidoqueen, despite being acquired early in the game, are also quite powerful and versatile Pokemon, so they are off the list as well. This leaves me with 4 choices. Of those 4, Rhydon, Kangaskhan, and Snorlax all share one common trait. While they have low to mid special stats, they have more than enough attack power to make up for it, so those 3 are also off the list. This leaves me with only one choice, Lickitung, and conveniently, its base stat total is one of the lowest on fully evolved Pokemon, so it fits into the team quite well. It does have a wide move pool open to it, so it does have its perks, but for now, it is the worst user of Surf. Now, I did take a look at Cut and Strength individually to pick out members of the team in a similar manner to Surf, but Lickitung is also able to learn those moves as well. That's quite an effective tongue if it can cut things. That means, if necessary, Lickitung could be the user of those moves if the other 5 members of the team could not learn them. Therefore, I can now pick members based solely on performance and stats and not field move restrictions. Speaking of base stats, the next step was to take a look at each Pokemon's base stat total to see what each Pokemon could offer. And before anyone says that it's as simple as just picking the 5 lowest base stat totals, there's a reason why Pokemon with low base stat totals could still be good Pokemon. On screen, I've placed the 8 fully evolved Pokemon with the lowest base stat total from left to right. Right away, I'm sure you can notice how only 3 of those Pokemon ended up on my final team, so why were the other ones excluded? I mean, look at Ditto here, whose base stat total is 50 points lower than Farfetch'd. Certainly seems like worse material, right? But like I said, base stats do not paint the entire picture, and this is especially true with Ditto. Ditto's gimmick is that it transforms into other Pokemon when in battle, and while it's doing that, its stats become that of the Pokemon it has transformed into, meaning its low base stats mean nothing in the long run. Due to this fact alone, it can be as strong as any legendary Pokemon if used properly, and because of that, it was excluded from the list. Butterfree is the next one I want to mention, since unlike Beedrill, it has some really great tools at its disposal. In addition to its access to Sleep Powder and Stun Spore, it can also use Psychic moves, and has a decent special stat. Because of that, it was excluded. Porygon is the next one I want to talk about, and it's a very interesting case. While it has the stats and wide move pool necessary to keep it off the list, the fact that it's only available at the Celadon Game Corner for a ludicrous amount of Game Corner coins meant that it might have had to have been excluded from the list simply for the impracticality of trying to obtain it. Thankfully, that was not the case. Finally, Mr. Mime and Jynx are easy to take off the list. If the fact that they were both psychic types wasn't enough, the high special stats combined with a wide and powerful move pool would certainly be all the proof needed to keep them off the list. This leaves me with 3 choices: Lickitung, Farfetch'd, and Beedrill. I've already discussed Lickitung, but before I go to the next group of Pokemon, I just want to quickly reiterate why Farfetch'd and Beedrill made the team. Farfetch'd is here due to its base stats being the lowest amongst all fully evolved Pokemon, besides Ditto, and its stat spread is balanced amongst all of its stats, meaning that it can't take advantage of them as effectively as other Pokemon can. It does have access to Slash, which does give it some power, but that comes a lot later. This makes it a lot harder to use Farfetch'd until it can reach the level necessary to get it. And Swords Dance isn't as effective in this game because of how critical hits work. If the mechanics of critical hits worked like they do in later games, then Farfetch'd could get a massive attack boost and a critical hit boost when it applies. But as it is, using Swords Dance is as effective as receiving a guaranteed critical hit, and Slash does that already. I would definitely say that Farfetch'd is the most unfortunate case of the game's mechanics working against it. And for Beedrill, it is the most unfortunate case of its types being the worst in the game. Bug and Poison do not get any strong high power moves, which means it is harder for Beedrill to be offensive, and the Poison status, while good if you can stall it, has problems if the opponent is able to keep knocking out Pokemon, due to how the Poison mechanics work in this game. Now it does have a small saving grace in Twin Needle, but that's really its only saving grace. So now we have 3 Pokemon on the team: Lickitung, Farfetch'd, and Beedrill. The next 3 aren't as clear cut, so let's take a look at the Pokemon who have a higher base stat total than Mr. Mime and Jynx. All of the Pokemon on screen have a base stat total within 10 points of each other, meaning that this really will come down to how they perform in the game. And right away, I can knock 3 of the group out. First, Wigglytuff can be taken off due to its massive HP pool and wide variety of moves. Just think of Wigglytuff as a way better Lickitung. Seriously, it beats it in everything but defense. Secondly, Marowak can be taken off due to it being a much better ground type than Onix. While Onix does have a massive defense stat and the rock typing, Marowak has a much better stat distribution while still having a large defense stat. Marowak can even learn special moves that can help its move coverage, while Onix is stuck using primarily rock and ground moves. But I will contend that Onix does get good rock and ground moves. And finally, Hitmonlee can be removed from the list due to its powerful moves and good stat distribution, which helps it to sweep through teams. While it doesn't have any move coverage outside of normal and fighting moves, the moves it does get have great power, so unless you're going up against a ghost type, there isn't much that can stop a Hitmonlee from doing damage. So now that leaves us with 4 other choices: Onix, Raticate, Hitmonchan, and Parasect. I've already touched on Onix a bit, but just to further expand on what I said previously, besides its massive defense, OK speed, and rock typing, its HP stat is abysmal, which means that it won't live as long as that defense stat will make you think it does. And its attack stat is incredibly low. It's even lower than Farfetch'd. And that super low special means that if it takes any special hit, even a low-powered neutral one, it'll fall quickly. This makes it a candidate for the team. Next is Raticate. Raticate has good attack and speed stats, a reliable normal move in Hyper Fang, a reliable support move with Super Fang, and has enough special that it can use some special moves for coverage. Really, the only thing that keeps it in the bottom is just the fact that the normal type offers no super effective damage on its own. And with the fact that there are so many normal types that do that job better, Raticate is now a candidate for the team. And to be fair, I consider Lickitung in the same boat. It just offers a little more defensive utility, while Raticate offers more offensive power. And that leaves us with 2, Hitmonchan and Parasect. And for full disclosure, after Wigglytuff, every Pokemon does something that makes it better than all previously mentioned Pokemon. Some other Pokemon that I initially considered were Golbat, Venomoth, and Arbok, and even then they have more than one quality about them that exempted them from the team. Golbat, despite not knowing many high power moves, can learn Confuse Ray to status the opponent, Screech to help either itself or teammates, and has a good enough special to make use of Mega Drain for coverage. It also has 45 more base stat points than Hitmonchan. Venomoth is effectively a better Butterfree, so every good thing I said about Butterfree applies here. And Arbok has a 100% accurate paralysis move in Glare, access to ground moves for coverage, decent, and I use decent in air quotes, poison moves, and Wrap, which is dangerous in its own right if used properly. At least it's more effective than when Onix uses Bind. And it just gets better from there for every other Pokemon. So between the remaining Parasect and Hitmonchan, which one is worse? Well, I initially chose Parasect for the run, so that means it would have had to have been worse, right? Well, after playing the run, my opinion has now changed. Initially, I thought that Parasect, despite having the 100% accurate sleep move in Spore, would be too slow to put an opponent to sleep, meaning it would be too difficult to knock out an opponent. Turns out that it had enough defenses to withstand hits and then sleep the opponent consistently. And silly me, I thought it would be difficult to use its special stat, which, if you were paying attention, it had the highest special stat on the team. Well, turns out that Mega Drain coming from a Parasect is actually really good. And its access to physical moves? Well, I certainly was surprised by how well Dig did for it, and while I didn't keep it, Slash is a good move in general, and if I wasn't adamant about keeping Leech Life specifically for Psychic types, I would have kept it. Parasect ended up surprising me so much that I no longer consider it one of the 6 worst fully evolved Pokemon. So where does that leave Hitmonchan? Well, since it's a fighting type similar to Hitmonlee, that would mean it would be off the list, since Hitmonlee is off the list, right? Well, not exactly. There are some minor differences that make Hitmonchan worse than Hitmonlee. To begin, Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee have the same base stat total, but while Hitmonlee has a higher attack and speed, Hitmonchan takes some of that attack and speed and puts it into defense. So right away, it is already at a bit of a disadvantage. But then we need to take a look at its moves. Hitmonlee receives a handful of fighting type moves unique to its species, including Rolling Kick, Jump Kick, and High Jump Kick. And while the jump kicks have recoil when they miss, in these games, the recoil damage is bugged to only deal 1 HP of damage, which basically means the drawbacks are virtually non-existent. Meanwhile, Hitmonchan gets access to the elemental punches, those being Fire Punch, Ice Punch, and Thunder Punch, which aren't even unique to Hitmonchan. But while Hitmonlee can use its impressive attack stat with its fighting moves, Hitmonchan has to use its pathetic special stat for its punches. And if Hitmonchan wants to use a fighting move that deals damage, it has to rely on Submission, which, while not the worst move, will inflict damage back on Hitmonchan. It has to slowly wear itself out just to deal fighting damage, and if you recall my rule about not being allowed to use items in battle, means that its best move puts it on a timer. And it can't even learn Submission by level up, it has to learn it by TM. Now, it can learn Body Slam and Mega Punch to give it some consistent power, or Seismic Toss for set damage, but with its lackluster ability to make full use of its move pool, these factors make it the new 6th member of the Worst Final Evolutions team. And that wraps up the process of how I decided on the team for this challenge, as well as the fixes I would make should I ever attempt this challenge again. It was a lot of fun to not only do all the planning for this, but to actually play Pokemon Red again and challenge myself with a set team. But to bring up the playthrough for a moment, there is one major thing I noticed while playing these games. Ignoring the very beginning of the playthrough with the gym battle with Brock because of early team limitations, and the last few major fights of the game, Pokemon Red and Blue are surprisingly easy when compared to later entries of the series. And even some of said later game fights were easy in their own right. There was a lot of imbalance in regards to types, stats, and move pools, meaning it was really easy to take advantage of the system and get through the game with little difficulty. I touched on this mostly with the Elite Four battles, but the way most of the opponents I faced were programmed was incredibly simple when compared to later generations. In later games, most important trainer battles would have Pokemon with custom movesets. These would often be strong moves that match the types of the Pokemon using them, as well as coverage moves to help deal with opponents that the particular Pokemon might have trouble with. You know, the way most trainers playing the game nowadays would raise them. But in these games, mostly due to the lack of moves, the movesets wouldn't vary too much from the individual Pokemon's standard level up script. Let's take Lorelei's Jynx for example. In Generation 1 Red and Blue, Jynx's moveset follows the standard level script that a regular Jynx would have at level 56, that being Double Slap, Ice Punch, Body Slam, and Thrash. Now Jynx is statistically a special attacking Pokemon, so even though it has 2 good normal moves, being Body Slam and Thrash, those moves are underutilized on a Pokemon like Jynx, who should be firing off powerful Psychic and Ice type moves. Even the fact that it has Double Slap is laughable considering how weak the move normally is. Even funnier, Jynx has a signature move in Lovely Kiss, a move that puts the opponent to sleep. And if you remember what I said about sleep mechanics, that would make it a very powerful move on Jynx. But Lorelei doesn't even have that on her Red and Blue team. But while these moves might be powerful, that potential for power means nothing if the computer doesn't pick those moves. And while the games do have a system in place when deciding the moves, it is still far from perfect, and sometimes can even be exploited. But in situations where there is no super effective damage to be dealt, each move has a near identical chance to be selected. So Jynx would roughly have a 1 in 4 chance to use its powerful Ice Punch, a 2 in 4 chance to use a normal move that does some damage, and a 1 in 4 chance to use a weak normal move. Far from the most difficult thing in the world. Now, if I was raising a Jynx in these games to be the best that it could, right away I would use the TMs for Psychic and Blizzard on it, since they are the strongest moves for those types. Then I would make sure to keep Lovely Kiss, since that is a powerful support move in its own right. After that, it would really be up to the user's preference as to what the last move would be, but I would either use Rest for health recovery, Reflect for defensive power, or Body Slam for attempts at paralysis. But this moveset would make Jynx very dangerous to deal with no matter what it was facing. Now I know that these were the early games, so I will not fault the programming for how easy it can make this game. All I'm saying is that when you take a look at what could have been done to make it much harder, it just has a long way to go. But to bring the easiness of these games into the perspective of my own team, a lot of those important battles that I thought I was going to struggle with were won thanks to Parasect and its Spore attack. As I stated many times, Alakazam was an incredibly powerful Pokemon that could be dangerous if not dealt with carefully. Its psychic attacks were dangerous threats to every member of my team, but if Parasect was in there and was able to Spore it down, it was almost guaranteed that Alakazam would be knocked out. But that meant it had to survive a psychic attack to do it, and since Parasect is much slower, it might have gotten knocked out in the process. After that, I had little else that could withstand a psychic attack onslaught. And if you recall, I said not too long ago that Parasect was no longer on the team, and that Hitmonchan was in. This means that I have lost a powerful Pokemon that could go up against Alakazam, and have replaced it with a Pokemon that would definitely get knocked out by one psychic attack. And that would mean I would have to fight a lot more and level up my team higher to get through the game, thus creating a much harder challenge for me. So maybe my conceived notions of this game's easiness are biased because I had a potential counter to some of the more difficult Pokemon? Well, perhaps. I would have to revisit the game at a future date and play through the game again with the new team and see how things would be different. But that, my friends, is a topic for another time. And that about wraps up my thoughts and processes with the team building of my Pokemon Red Worst Final Evolutions playthrough. And I hope you had fun with me on this adventure as well. I have a lot more in store for challenges like this, including an upcoming Pokemon Crystal playthrough that will follow the same rule set I had here. But I can promise you that it will be a much greater challenge than what I had going through here. So if you're interested, why don't you come join me on that adventure as well, and I promise that it will be a lot of fun. Anyways, that's all from me today, so as always, take care, stay safe, and have a good day.